Imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the unknown. Your heart races. Your mind floods with every worst-case scenario. And the pit of your stomach tightens with fear. What if you fall? What if it's too much? What if you fail? Now, imagine that same fear, only this time. It's not about a physical cliff. It's the fear of your future. The fear of failure. Of rejection. Or the fear that you're not enough. It's the invisible weight that keeps you from making decisions, from taking risks, or from embracing the change you know you need. The fear that makes you freeze in place, paralyzed by its grip. What if I told you that this fear you're feeling, this deep, consuming fear, is not as real as it seems? That it's not something you have to avoid, fight against, or let control your life? In fact, what if I told you that this fear can be transformed? That there's a way to break free from its suffocating hold and unlock a life of freedom, peace, and power? Today, we're diving deep into 6 profound Buddhist lessons that will help you confront and conquer your fears, once and for all. These teachings aren't just abstract philosophies. They are practical, transformative tools that have been used for thousands of years by some of the most courageous and enlightened figures in history. So, if you're ready to face your fears head-on, discover what's holding you back, and finally embrace the life you're meant to live, then stick with me. Because what you're about to hear has the power to change everything. This isn't just about learning to manage fear. This is about breaking free from it completely. Let's dive in. Lesson 1: Understanding fear. Fear, at its core, is a natural human emotion. But it is also deeply misunderstood. It often arises from our perception of danger. Yet this perception is not always based on reality. Fear tends to stem from our attachments, desires, and distorted beliefs about the world around us. As such, it's not always a rational response to actual threats, but more a reaction shaped by our thoughts and emotions. In Buddhism, fear is seen as a mental construct, not something inherent in the world itself. This view is based on the Buddhist concept of avidya, or ignorance. The ignorance of seeing things as permanent when in reality, everything is in a constant state of flux. Fear becomes the byproduct of this ignorance. We believe that we can hold on to certain outcomes, that success or failure is something that defines us, and that these external circumstances will determine our happiness or peace. This illusion leads to anxiety, worry, and fear. The truth, according to Buddhist teachings, is that all things are impermanent, Anicca, including our fears. The very things we fear today will change, evolve, or fade away tomorrow. In this sense, fear, like everything else, is transient, and should be viewed in the context of this impermanence. The key to overcoming fear is realizing that it is often an illusion, a mental construct that arises when we mistake the fleeting for the permanent. The nature of fear. To understand fear, we first need to question where it comes from. Why do we fear failure, rejection, or even the unknown? It's not the situation itself that generates fear. but our mental attachments to outcomes. For example, if you fear failure, it's because you've attached your self-worth to success or failure. You believe that failure is a permanent state. And if you fail, it means something is wrong with you. But in truth, failure is just a momentary event. It doesn't define you, it doesn't define anyone. It is simply part of a cycle of learning, growth, and change. Take, for instance, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is widely regarded as one of the greatest U.S. presidents. Yet his life was filled with failures, struggles, and fear. Before his presidency, he lost several elections, went bankrupt, and faced personal grief. Yet, despite these failures, Lincoln continued to rise, using his past setbacks as stepping stones for greater achievements. Had Lincoln allowed fear of failure to control him, he would have never moved forward, and history would have been very different. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that failure wasn't permanent. He kept moving forward because he recognized that fear was not something to be avoided or suppressed, but something to be understood and worked through. In the same way, Oprah Winfrey has spoken candidly about her struggles with fear and self-doubt early in her career. At the outset of her career, Oprah was often told that she wasn't fit for television, that she didn't have the right look or demeanor. She could have easily given in to these fears and criticisms, letting them define her future. Instead, she took calculated risks, embraced her imperfections, and realized that the fear of failure didn't have to control her destiny. Oprah's journey is a powerful example of someone who understood that fear is not a permanent barrier, but a temporary feeling that can be overcome with resilience. Lesson 2, Impermanence, Anicca. One of the most profound and liberating teachings in Buddhism is the concept of impermanence, Anicca. It's the understanding that everything in life is transient, constantly changing, and nothing lasts forever. This includes not only the physical world around us, but also our emotions, experiences, and, most importantly, our fears. At the heart of impermanence is the idea that everything is in a state of flux. We may be attached to things, our career, relationships, achievements, and fear losing them. But the truth is, change is inevitable. The fear of losing something we love or fear facing an uncertain future comes from our attachment to its permanence. When we deeply internalize the truth of Anicca, it frees us from the grip of fear, because we understand that everything, including our worries, is temporary. Buddhist insight. In Buddhism, we're taught that all things are transient, and this includes our fears. Fear often arises from our attachment to specific outcomes, like the desire to control the future or to hold on to what we know. When we face challenges, we fear losing what we love or not achieving the outcomes we desire. But the core Buddhist teaching is this: nothing in life is permanent. Whether it's joy or sorrow, success or failure, every experience is part of a cycle of constant change. This principle of impermanence allows us to loosen our grip on outcomes. The anxiety that often fuels our fears stems from the belief that things will remain the same forever. that things must go as planned. When we accept that all things are fluid and dynamic, we begin to see fear for what it really is, a reaction to a mental construct, not an eternal reality. Example story. Consider the example of Emily, a woman in her mid-30s working at a large corporation. 4 months. She's been consumed by the fear of being laid off due to a looming corporate downsizing. Every day, she spends hours worrying, checking company emails obsessively, and staying awake at night, imagining the worst-case scenarios. She envisions herself unable to pay her bills, losing her house, or being unable to support her family. One day, Emily stumbles upon a meditation group, and as she begins to explore the teachings of Buddhism, she comes across the doctrine of Anicca, impermanence. At first, it's a concept that seems abstract, but as she reflects deeper, she realizes something profound. Everything in life changes, whether it's the highs or the lows. Her career, her emotions, even the fear she feels right now, nothing is permanent. Emily's fear of losing her job has been rooted in the belief that it would mark an unchangeable downfall. But when she embraces the teaching of impermanence, she realizes that the fear she is holding on to is based on an illusion of permanence. Just as her job can change, so too can the world of opportunities. She realizes that even if she does lose her job, it won't be the end of her world. It will simply be a phase, a transition into a new chapter. The fear loses its power over her because she begins to see it as something temporary, something that too shall pass. Through this shift in perspective, Emily begins to approach her career with a sense of calm, rather than obsessing over a future she cannot control. She focuses on what she can do now, working with integrity, learning new skills, and accepting that change is part of life. The fear of losing her job no longer dominates her thoughts, and she begins to act with confidence, knowing that whatever happens next is just another change in the cycle of life. Reflection. When we truly understand and embrace the impermanence of life, we begin to free ourselves from the constant fear of loss. Fear arises when we hold on too tightly to things, when we mistakenly believe that everything we value is permanent and unchangeable. But once we accept the reality of change, that everything is in a constant state of flux, fear starts to dissolve. It's no longer something we need to resist or fight against. Instead, we learn to let go. The fear of loss is often rooted in our attachments to people, places, and possessions, and the belief that we can control the future. However, when we let go of these attachments, we stop fearing the inevitable changes that life brings. The impermanence of life becomes a liberating force, teaching us to live with more flexibility, openness, and peace. Consider the life of Steve Jobs, one of the most iconic entrepreneurs of the 21st century. Jobs faced numerous failures and losses throughout his life. He was ousted from Apple, the very company he had founded, and faced many public and personal struggles. However, he had an extraordinary understanding of impermanence. He knew that life was full of cycles, what he had built could change, and what he lost was only temporary. After his return to Apple, He led the company to unimaginable success. Jobs' resilience came from his deep understanding that even in the face of loss and hardship, change is inevitable and often opens the door to something new. Similarly, Nelson Mandela faced decades of imprisonment and the destruction of his personal life and dreams. Yet, through it all, he maintained a profound understanding of Anicca. Mandela knew that his suffering, though real, was not permanent, and that it would pass. His faith in change, and his ability to adapt, kept him going. Even in the face of one of the longest and most oppressive imprisonments in modern history, Mandela emerged to lead his country to peace. He accepted that nothing is fixed, that change, even the painful kind, is simply another part of life's impermanence. By embracing the teaching of impermanence, we start to see our fears in a new light. They are not permanent. They are passing clouds, momentary illusions that can't define us. When we stop clinging to the idea that things should remain the same, we open ourselves to the flow of life, reducing the grip of fear on our hearts and minds. In the end, the key to overcoming fear is not in fighting it, but in understanding it. Fear is temporary, just like everything else. Once we accept that life, with all its uncertainties, is in a constant state of change, we can release the power that fear holds over us. Lesson 3: Self-awareness and mindfulness. Fear often emerges from a lack of self-awareness. When we react impulsively or let our emotions control us, we become entangled in our fears. Mindfulness and self-awareness, however, allow us to see our fears as they truly are. Not as monsters under the bed, but as transient thoughts and emotions that come and go. In Buddhism, mindfulness, or sati, is the practice of bringing our full attention to the present moment. It involves observing our thoughts, emotions, and sensations without judgment, without reacting or getting caught up in them. By becoming more mindful, we develop the ability to see fear for what it is: a mental reaction, not a reality. We can watch fear arise and dissipate without being swept away by it. Self-awareness is a critical part of this process. By understanding the roots of our fears, why we feel afraid, what triggers those emotions, and how we habitually react to them, we begin to disempower them. Instead of fear controlling us, we learn to control how we respond to it. The power of mindfulness in overcoming fear. When we practice mindfulness, we learn to separate our identity from our emotions. Fear becomes just another passing moment, rather than something that defines us. This shift in perception is often the key to overcoming our fears. Because we stop identifying with the fear itself, we can observe fear, but we don't have to be the fear. Take, for example, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is one of the most iconic figures in history, known for leading India's fight for independence through nonviolent resistance. Despite the enormous pressure and threats of violence against him, Gandhi's courage was grounded in his deep practice of mindfulness and self-awareness. He was able to observe the fear that arose within him, whether it was fear of death, fear of failure, or fear of not achieving his goals. But he did not let it control him. Instead, He faced these fears with calm clarity, grounding himself in his values and purpose. Gandhi's ability to stay centered, despite overwhelming fear, was crucial to his success. Similarly, Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, was no stranger to fear. But throughout his imprisonment, Mandela practiced mindfulness, reflecting on his emotions and thoughts rather than reacting impulsively to them. He realized that fear, especially in the face of adversity, was natural. But rather than allow fear to paralyze him, he embraced it as a part of the journey. Mandela's strength wasn't in denying fear, but in understanding it and continuing to move forward despite it. Realizing fear is not reality. Mindfulness also teaches us to observe the impermanence of fear in real time. Take the example of someone dealing with social anxiety. They might have an overwhelming fear of public speaking or social interactions. Through mindfulness, they can learn to observe the physical sensations: racing heart, sweaty palms, without attaching the label of "I am anxious" to those feelings. Over time, by bringing attention to the present moment, they start to see that the fear is not a permanent part of their identity, but simply a passing emotional experience. With practice, they can act in spite of their fear, not because they are fearless, but because they have learned to accept and coexist with their fear. The practice of mindfulness can be transformative when it comes to fear. When we bring awareness to our fears without judgment or reaction, they lose their power. Fear no longer becomes something we avoid or suppress. It becomes something we acknowledge and move through. A modern-day example of this principle can be seen in Brené Brown, a research professor and author who studies vulnerability and courage. In her work, Brown often speaks about her own struggles with vulnerability and fear. She notes that when we suppress fear or try to control it, we inadvertently give it more power. However, when we acknowledge our fear, sit with it, and allow it to exist without letting it define us, we create the space to move forward. Brown's ability to lean into her own vulnerability and fear is a testament to the power of mindfulness in overcoming challenges. Reflection. By practicing mindfulness, we realize that our fears are not a part of us. They are simply passing states of mind. When we observe our fears through the lens of self-awareness, we see that they do not control us. We control how we respond to them. Through mindfulness, fear becomes something we acknowledge and observe, rather than something that dictates our actions. When we're able to step back and notice our fear without getting entangled in it, we free ourselves from its grasp. Fear doesn't define us unless we allow it to. By developing a practice of mindfulness and self-awareness, we can change our relationship with fear. It's no longer something to be avoided or feared. It's just another experience that will come and go. And in that space of observation, we find freedom. Lesson 4. Detachment, Vairagya. Fear is often rooted in attachment. Attachment to outcomes, possessions, identities, and even relationships. When we are attached to a particular result or experience, the fear of losing it can overwhelm us. Buddhism teaches that attachment is a primary source of suffering, and that detachment, or Vairagya, is the key to releasing fear. Detachment does not mean abandoning everything or becoming emotionally numb. Rather, it is the ability to let go of our expectations and desires, without becoming overly attached to specific outcomes. This doesn't mean we stop caring, but we develop a sense of inner peace and stability that is not dependent on external conditions. In this way, we are free from the anxiety that arises when things don't go the way we hope. Buddhist insight. Vairagya is the wisdom to understand that nothing in this world is permanent or fully under our control. The more we attach our happiness to transient things, the more susceptible we become to fear and suffering. By practicing detachment, we learn to live with an open hand, accepting that everything we value, relationships, possessions, success, is temporary and subject to change. Through this acceptance, we free ourselves from the fear of loss. The role of detachment in overcoming fear. When we are attached to something, we fear its loss. If we hold on to our job as the only source of our identity, we fear being laid off. If we place all our self-worth in a relationship, we fear abandonment or rejection. But detachment helps us realize that our true worth is not tied to any external factor. It is inherent in who we are as individuals. Example of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, had an extraordinary life filled with highs and lows. At one point, he was famously ousted from the very company he helped create. This was a moment that could have been devastating. But Jobs exhibited remarkable detachment. Rather than letting his identity be completely wrapped up in Apple, he moved forward by creating Pixar, which later revolutionized animation. Jobs didn't allow the loss of control over Apple to define him. And this detachment allowed him to find new avenues of success. Ultimately, he returned to Apple with a fresh perspective, and led it to become one of the most valuable companies in the world. Similarly, Bruce Lee, the legendary martial artist, practiced detachment not only in his training but also in his approach to life and martial arts. Bruce Lee once said, "Absorb what is useful. Discard what is not. Add what is uniquely your own." This mindset exemplifies detachment, an ability to embrace change, adapt, and not cling to outdated methods or beliefs. Bruce Lee's detachment allowed him to redefine martial arts in a way that transcended traditional limitations, moving beyond fears of failure or inadequacy. Detachment from results. Another key aspect of detachment is letting go of the need for specific outcomes. In Buddhism, it is often said that we should perform our duties without attachment to the results. This teaching, found in the Bhagavad Gita and echoed in Buddhist thought, stresses that the act of doing is more important than the outcome. The fear of failure often comes from an obsession with the results. But when we focus on the present moment and the process itself, we let go of the need to control everything. Take the example of Edison. Thomas Edison famously failed over 1,000 times before inventing the electric light bulb. Many would view this as repeated failure. But Edison's detachment from the need for success allowed him to view each failure as part of the process. He wasn't attached to any specific outcome, but rather focused on the experiment itself. His detachment from the need for success was what ultimately led him to one of the greatest breakthroughs in modern history. Real-life application of detachment. Imagine someone going through a major life change. Say, losing a job or ending a relationship. The natural human response might be to panic, to fear the unknown, and to cling to the past. But when we practice detachment, we allow ourselves the freedom to embrace the change and the growth that comes with it. We stop seeing loss as a threat and begin to view it as a natural part of life's flow. This shift in perspective can help us overcome fear and transform difficult situations into opportunities for growth. For example, J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series, faced numerous rejections before finding a publisher. At one point, she was living in near poverty, struggling with personal issues, and uncertain about her future. If Rowling had been overly attached to the idea of becoming a famous author, she might have given up after the initial rejections. But her detachment from the outcome, combined with her belief in her craft, allowed her to continue writing. Ultimately, her success was born from this deep sense of inner resolve, and the ability to let go of attachment to any one specific result. Reflection: the freedom of detachment. Detachment doesn't mean abandoning our goals or relationships. It means cultivating an attitude of openness and non-attachment. We stop clinging to expectations and open ourselves to the flow of life, understanding that what we fear losing is, in fact, impermanent. The more we let go, the less fear has a hold on us. In practicing detachment, we embrace the impermanence of life, freeing ourselves from the anxiety of losing something that was never truly ours to begin with. Whether it's success, possessions, or relationships, nothing is permanent. When we accept this, we realize that fear has no place in our lives, and we can move through the world with greater peace and confidence. In practicing detachment, we embrace the impermanence of life, freeing ourselves from the anxiety of losing something that was never truly ours to begin with. Whether it's success, possessions, or relationships, nothing is permanent. When we accept this, we realize that fear has no place in our lives, and we can move through the world with greater peace and confidence. Lesson 5: Compassion, Karuna. Fear is not only a personal experience, but can also arise in response to how we perceive others. Often, our fears are linked to judgment or misunderstanding of others, or even a fear of how we are perceived by the world. This is where compassion plays a crucial role in overcoming fear. Compassion, or karuna in Buddhist terms, is the practice of cultivating deep empathy and understanding for others and ourselves. When we connect with others' struggles, we realize that we are not alone in our fears and insecurities, which in turn diminishes the hold fear has on us. In Buddhism, compassion extends beyond sympathy. It involves actively working to alleviate the suffering of others, while recognizing that we, too, are subject to suffering. This understanding creates a shared humanity, one in which fear becomes less isolating and more a collective experience. Compassion teaches us that when we open our hearts to others, we not only reduce our own fears, but also help to reduce the fears of others. Buddhist insight. When we practice compassion, we stop seeing ourselves as separate from others. Fear often arises from the illusion of separateness, the belief that we are isolated in our experiences. But compassion teaches us to recognize the interconnectedness of all beings. This recognition helps to ease our fears, as we realize that we are not alone in facing challenges. By extending compassion to others, we naturally begin to extend compassion to ourselves, reducing the power of fear in both our lives and the lives of those around us. Compassion as a way to overcome fear. Compassion works on multiple levels. First, it helps us see that fear is not unique to us. It is a shared human experience. We are all afraid of something. Whether it's losing someone we love, failing in our careers, or simply facing the unknown. When we open ourselves to the pain and fear of others, we see that fear is universal, which makes our own fears feel less isolating. Example of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa is a shining example of compassion in action. She dedicated her life to serving the poorest of the poor, working with individuals who were suffering from disease, neglect, and abandonment. Her work was filled with hardship, and no doubt, she faced many fears. Fear of disease, fear of failure, and fear of not making a difference. However, her deep compassion for the suffering of others allowed her to transcend these fears. She did not allow fear to stop her from serving others, even when the task seemed insurmountable. Her ability to embrace the suffering of others and to offer care without fear of the consequences gave her the strength to change the world in profound ways. Example of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is another figure who exemplifies compassion as a means of overcoming fear. Despite the tremendous suffering he has witnessed throughout his life, including the loss of his homeland and the oppression of his people, the Dalai Lama has remained a beacon of compassion. His philosophy is clear. The antidote to fear and suffering is love and compassion. Rather than succumb to bitterness or hatred, he advocates for cultivating compassion toward others, recognizing that we are all interconnected. This practice has helped him face personal and political challenges with courage, teaching the world that fear can be overcome when we open our hearts to the suffering of others. The ripple effect of compassion. Compassion not only reduces our own fear, but also has the power to ease the fears of others. When we offer a listening ear, a kind word, or an act of service, we are extending the compassion that helps others feel less alone in their fears. This creates a ripple effect, a cycle of kindness and understanding that spreads outward. Example of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most significant leaders in the civil rights movement, was another embodiment of compassion in the face of fear. Throughout his activism, King faced immense danger, hostility, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, despite the overwhelming fears surrounding him, King continued to practice compassion, not only for those who were oppressed, but even for those who opposed him. He recognized that fear often arose from ignorance and hatred, and he sought to transform that fear with love and understanding. His famous quote, "Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that," illustrates how compassion can be a powerful force in overcoming fear and conflict. Compassion shifts our perspective. Instead of focusing on our own fears, we begin to see others' suffering as equally important. This shared experience of vulnerability reduces the power of fear and replaces it with a sense of connection and purpose. Compassion and self-compassion. Perhaps one of the most profound ways compassion helps us overcome fear is through self-compassion. Many of our fears are born from the way we treat ourselves. Our inner critic, our self-judgment, and our belief that we are unworthy or incapable. By practicing self-compassion, we give ourselves the permission to be human, to experience fear without letting it define us. Example of Brené Brown. Brené Brown, a researcher and author, is known for her work on vulnerability and self-compassion. In her research, she discovered that people who practice self-compassion are far more resilient to fear and shame than those who don't. By accepting our flaws, our limitations, and our mistakes with kindness, we develop the strength to face our fears head-on. Brown's work shows that self-compassion creates a healthier relationship with ourselves, which in turn makes us less fearful of failure, judgment, and rejection. Through compassion, whether for others or ourselves, we create a safe space where fear can be observed but not allowed to dominate. Compassion allows us to meet fear with understanding, with empathy, and with the recognition that fear is just one part of the larger human experience. Lesson 6: The Middle Path. Fear often arises when we swing between extremes. Either we become paralyzed by fear, avoiding risks and opportunities, or we become reckless, ignoring potential dangers altogether. In both cases, our minds are clouded by either excessive attachment or excessive aversion. The Buddhist teaching of the middle path offers a balanced approach to life that avoids these extremes, teaching us to act with wisdom, moderation, and clarity. The middle path, or Majjhima Patipada, is the Buddha's core teaching for living a balanced life, free from the clutches of fear and excess. It is the way of moderation, avoiding both indulgence and asceticism, finding a path of wisdom between self-denial and self-indulgence. In the context of fear, the middle path teaches us how to approach life with discernment, facing our fears with courage while also acknowledging the wisdom of caution and mindfulness. Buddhist insight. In Buddhist thought, extremes often cause suffering. We may fear making the wrong decision and try to avoid making any decision at all. Or we may act impulsively without considering the consequences, leading to regret. The middle path encourages us to navigate life with a balanced mindset, rather than seeking to avoid fear at all costs or charging headfirst into dangerous situations. The middle path allows us to assess our fears with clarity and to respond thoughtfully. The middle path in overcoming fear. When we are caught in extremes, we are often driven by fear in either direction. If we are too cautious, we may fear failure or rejection so much that we avoid any opportunity for growth or change. On the other hand, if we are too reckless, we may ignore our fears and take risks without considering the potential harm or consequences. The middle path helps us strike a balance, teaching us to face our fears with understanding, to act with intention, and to avoid both the paralysis of fear and the blindness of recklessness. Example of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, was known for his boldness, courage, and sense of adventure. Yet, Roosevelt also practiced moderation in his approach to fear and decision-making. He believed in facing challenges head-on but also understood the value of careful consideration. Roosevelt's famous saying, "Do what you can, with what you have, where you are," embodies the middle path approach to fear. He didn't ignore his fears, but he didn't let them paralyze him either. Instead, he evaluated risks thoughtfully and moved forward with calculated courage. Whether it was leading a military charge or tackling domestic issues, Roosevelt embodied the balance between embracing fear and acting with wisdom. Example of the Buddha. The Buddha himself is the perfect example of the middle path in overcoming fear. Prior to his enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama had lived a life of extreme indulgence as a prince, and then experienced extreme asceticism in search of liberation. It was only after abandoning both extremes that he discovered the middle path, a path of moderation that ultimately led him to enlightenment. The Buddha's life shows that the key to overcoming fear is not to avoid it completely, or dive headfirst into it recklessly, but to confront it with a balanced mind, recognizing it, understanding it, and then moving forward with wisdom. Example of Malala Yousafzai. Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani activist for girls' education, provides another powerful example of the middle path in action. After surviving an assassination attempt by the Taliban for advocating for girls' education, Malala could have been consumed by fear, avoiding speaking out or remaining silent. But instead of being paralyzed by fear or lashing out in anger, Malala chose a path of moderation. She continued to speak up for education and equality, balancing her courage with wisdom and compassion. Her approach to fear wasn't reckless but calculated. She faced her fears directly, but she did so with the understanding that moderation, self-care, and foresight were equally important. Balance in everyday life. The middle path doesn't require us to live in a state of constant fearlessness or recklessness. Instead, it invites us to develop a balanced, mindful approach to fear. Fear becomes manageable when we face it with wisdom, when we assess situations realistically and act thoughtfully. By following the middle path, we learn to neither overreact to fear nor ignore it altogether. For example, in our everyday lives, we might fear making mistakes at work, fear rejection in our relationships, or fear the unknown future. The middle path teaches us that these fears do not need to control us. We can acknowledge the fear without allowing it to dictate our actions. We can face challenges, taking the necessary precautions. But we also learn to trust ourselves and move forward with confidence and clarity. By integrating the middle path into our daily lives, we create a more peaceful, balanced existence. We learn to confront our fears not by avoiding them or charging blindly at them, but by taking deliberate, wise actions that promote growth, security, and peace of mind. It is in this balance, this middle path, that we discover the true freedom from fear. Lesson 7: Acceptance and Letting Go. One of the most powerful lessons Buddhism teaches is the art of acceptance. Accepting ourselves, our circumstances, and the world as it is. Fear often arises when we resist or deny certain aspects of our lives. We fear change. We fear loss. We fear the unknown. These fears grow out of our resistance to what is. Buddhism encourages us to let go of this resistance and embrace life as it comes, without clinging to what we cannot control. Acceptance is not about passivity, but rather about acknowledging reality as it is, and allowing ourselves to flow with it, rather than fighting against it. Buddhist insight. The Buddhist principle of upekkha, equanimity, teaches us to develop a balanced mind that is neither disturbed by pleasure nor by pain. Fear often arises from our attachment to certain outcomes, desiring things to go a certain way or fearing things will go wrong. But by accepting the impermanence of all things, we release the need for control and find peace. Acceptance allows us to let go of our fears because we recognize that nothing is fixed or permanent, and that change is a natural part of life. Acceptance does not mean giving up, resigning ourselves to suffering, or being passive. It means acknowledging that some things are beyond our control, and that resisting them only causes more suffering. When we let go of our need to control, we release the anxiety and fear that come from that need. The role of acceptance in overcoming fear. Fear often emerges from our desire to control situations or outcomes. We fear losing control, whether it's over our career, our relationships, or our health. Acceptance teaches us that there are things in life we simply cannot control, and that peace comes not from fighting against reality but from embracing it. When we stop resisting change, failure, or loss, we stop feeding our fears. Acceptance brings peace because it frees us from the constant need to fight the current of life. Example of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, is an excellent example of someone who embodied the power of acceptance in overcoming fear. During his time in Nazi concentration camps, Frankl faced unimaginable suffering, loss, and fear. Yet, he found a way to rise above the despair. Frankl wrote in his famous book Man's Search for Meaning that even in the face of suffering, we always have the freedom to choose our attitude. Frankl accepted the reality of his situation, the horror of the camps, and instead of succumbing to fear, he embraced a sense of purpose that helped him transcend the suffering around him. His acceptance of what he could not change allowed him to maintain his inner freedom and dignity, even when his outer circumstances were utterly bleak. Example of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama's life is a powerful testament to the practice of acceptance. Having witnessed the destruction of his homeland and the suffering of his people, he could have easily given into despair and fear. Instead, the Dalai Lama accepted the situation and embraced the reality that his circumstances were beyond his control. Rather than focusing on what he lost, he focused on what he could still offer. The power of compassion, kindness, and peace. His acceptance didn't mean resignation, but rather a recognition that we can find peace and purpose in even the most difficult circumstances. His ability to let go of attachment to the outcomes of his efforts has made him one of the most revered spiritual leaders in the world. Acceptance of fear itself. One of the most profound aspects of acceptance is learning to accept our fears as part of being human. Instead of rejecting or fearing our fear, we can learn to sit with it, observe it, and understand it. Fear is a natural emotion, but it becomes problematic when we try to push it away or deny its existence. When we accept fear as a normal part of our emotional landscape, it no longer has the power to control us. Take the example of Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, who, despite his ongoing struggles, always emphasizes the importance of accepting our emotions, including fear, without being overwhelmed by them. The Dalai Lama has often said that fear is a natural response to certain situations, but it is how we choose to react to that fear that matters. When we allow fear to exist without judgment, we disempower it. We stop running from it and start confronting it directly. In doing so, we build inner strength, resilience, and the ability to act with wisdom, even in the face of fear. Through acceptance, we realize that fear, like everything else, is impermanent. It comes, it stays for a time, and then it leaves. By accepting it, we transform our relationship with fear and gain the freedom to move forward without being controlled by it. Conclusion. As we've explored today, fear is not the impenetrable wall we often think it is. It's a shadow cast by our attachments, misconceptions, and resistance to the flow of life. By embracing the wisdom of Buddhism, we learn that fear is not something to be fought or suppressed, but understood and transformed. Whether through the power of mindfulness, compassion, detachment, or acceptance, each of these teachings gives us the tools to face fear with clarity, peace, and strength. Now, imagine what your life could look like if you truly began to apply these lessons. What could you accomplish if fear no longer had the power to hold you back? What risks could you take? What dreams could you pursue? And how much more freedom could you experience? It's time to let go of the illusion that fear controls you. It's time to step into your power, face the unknown with courage, and live a life of purpose. These Buddhist teachings aren't just ideas, they're invitations to a new way of being. And the first step begins with you. If you found value in this video, if you feel inspired to start facing your fears and transforming your life, I encourage you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Join our community of seekers, learners, and those committed to finding peace, balance, and strength. Every week, we're diving into powerful teachings that will help you live a life of clarity and confidence. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What fear are you ready to face? What part of this lesson resonated with you the most? Let's start a conversation. I'd love to hear your journey. And together, we can support one another as we all strive to live fearlessly. Thank you for being here with me today. Until next time, stay balanced, stay courageous, and remember, the only thing standing between you and your greatest potential is the fear you choose to let go of. See you in the next video. Folded hands.